who weren't here today, who also helped plan this program, is Shania, who is another career advisor at CLBR. And she was super instrumental in helping us find you wonderful panelists. So super happy to have her part of this programming experience. And then also Izzy is one of the student workers at CLBR who was also instrumental in supporting this program. So kudos to them. Izzy should be able to join a little bit later. So we may see them a little bit later. So just to kind of give an overview of our time together and what is bringing us together this evening, we're really going to be talking about how we are going to be critiquing and navigating professionalism, and we'll give some working definitions of what that looks like in practice and what that might look like in our lived experiences. And so hence why we have wonderful alumni panelists here with us, which I'll introduce you all to them later. Before we get started, I do want to open this space up with a land acknowledgement very quickly, and then we will kind of go from there. So you all should be able, if you're able to see the land acknowledgement, I'm going to read it out loud. So the Portland metro area rests on traditional tribal lands of the Multnomah, Wasco, Cowlitz, Cathlamet, Clackamas, bands of Chinook and Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and many other tribes who stewarded this land along the Columbia River. We honor and pay reverence to our Indigenous extended families. We also recognize and pay reverence to the enslaved Black people whose slave labor built this country, or helped to build this country. We also pay homage to our Asian and Latinx and other communities of color in their fight toward justice and liberation on this land and many other lands connected by seas and oceans. So a little bit about our intention for today. So the MRC and the CLBR, we're really excited to have our wonderful alumni panelists here with us today. And they're going to be speaking about their experiences, again, navigating and critiquing professionalism. And they're also going to provide some really great tactical strategies for all participants to think about that they've used in their life. And so without further ado, I'm going to actually open it up for our panelists to begin. Or actually, I'm going to give it over to Hayden. And Hayden, you're going to share a little bit about professionalism.
Yeah. So wanted to start by giving a working definition of professionalism. So the definition that we are going to use today is defined by the National Association of Colleges and Employers, also known as NACE. They work to define career competencies and other things, and they do have a definition of professionalism that we will be using for the sake of today's presentation. So what they say about professionalism is it's the ability to demonstrate personal accountability and effective work habits, e.g. punctuality, working productively with others, and time workload management, and understand the impact of nonverbal communication on professional work image. The individual demonstrates integrity and ethical behavior, acts responsibly with the interests of the larger community in mind, and is able to learn from his or her mistakes. So that is what we're going to be moving forward with today as sort of a working definition of professionalism, and what will we continue to come back to as we talk about critiquing professionalism overall. So I feel like when I just read that off of the NACE website, I'm like, oh, that sounds nice, like no problems, right? Like that sounds good. But as many of you may already know or have sort of felt due to sort of like a sense of dissonance with the idea of professionalism and your experience with the idea of professionalism, that professionalism is deeply rooted in white supremacy. So I wanted to go ahead and read a quote from Asa Gray's article from the Stanford Social Innovation Review called The Bias of Professionalism Standards that gives us a little context to work from as we're thinking about how professionalism and white supremacy are intertwined. White supremacy culture at an organizational level is apparent in the belief that traditional standards and values are objective and unbiased. The emphasis on a sense of urgency and quantity over quality, which can be summarized by the phrase, the ends justify the means. Perfectionism that leaves little room for mistakes and binary thinking. These values, established over time as history and fact, have been used to create the narrative of white supremacy that underpins professionalism today, playing out in the hiring, firing, and day-to-day management of workplaces around the world. So as we're going through, we're getting ready to give it over to the panelists, but I want you all to explore these questions, and sort of use this as a way to be thinking about how we can all take part in sort of changing the idea and the definition of professionalism. So what is your own personal relationship to the standards of professionalism? What are your thoughts on it? How do you feel about it? Like when someone tells you that you need to act more professional, how does that make you feel? How have you seen these standards of professionalism play out in your own workplace? And that may also come up in the classroom. This may be coming up in meetings that you're having with on-campus group. If you have an on-campus position, how has this come to play in those different spaces? And how have you potentially contributed to these standards? What are some ways you have seen others challenge professionalism standards at an organizational or individual level? And then lastly, who might be an ally in changing your workplace culture? So without further ado, we would love to turn it over to the panelists to go ahead and introduce themselves. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can all see their lovely faces.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hayden. And so just a reminder, panelists, if you don't mind sharing your name, your pronouns, your grad year, which that'll be showing under your picture there. And then also just a little bit about who you are and what your work looks like. And so we'll start with Paapa, and then Paapa, you can go ahead and popcorn to any of our other panelists, Lillyanne, Jacey, or Samrath.
Sure, absolutely. Hi, everyone. My name is Paapa Mensa. My pronouns are he, him, his. I am originally from Ghana. And if you don't know where Ghana is, it's just east of New York. And Reed brought me all the way to the US, and I'm a Reed Econ grad of 2015. And then I went on to do my master's in finance at Portland State. So I've been here in Portland for the last almost 10 years now, which is crazy. I have worked in higher ed at Reed and PSU before moving in 2019 to a B2B tech company in Portland called Viewpoint, which is owned by a larger company called Trimble. So I worked here in this company for a year as a pricing and product analyst, where I would develop like different pricing models and execute pricing strategies to accelerate the growth in the subscription space. And then I recently transitioned into my current role in December 2020. So I now work at Viewpoint still as a Salesforce administrator. If you've not heard about Salesforce, it is pretty much the biggest company in the world or close to it. Many of the world's largest companies run their business with that. So I'm one of two people in my company who is responsible for making the platform work and take for my company's unique needs. So it's a lot of work, but it's fun. Outside of work, I have found a way to combine my econ education and my finance education with my passion for empowering people. And so when I'm not designing or building any solutions in Salesforce, you can find me serving my local community through my church or advising small local businesses on pricing and financial management, or producing music in my home studio, which you're in right now. So thank you so much for your time. I'm honored to be here. I will pass it on to Jacey.
Awesome. Thanks, Paapa. Also, your music is fire.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Appreciate it.
So hi, everyone. My name is Jacey. I use she, her pronouns. I graduated Reed with an English degree in 2020. So I'm a young grad like Lillyanne. My career is in education. I've worked as a house advisor at Reed. I've worked at the student center at Reed, which has had many name changes. So just the student center for me. And then outside of Reed, I've worked for summer camps. I taught Sunday school. I taught vacation Bible school, preschool. And then since graduating, I worked a little bit on an Eddings grant, but most of my work has been with children in classrooms. So in the fall, I lived with my partner in Iowa for a little bit, which was one of the only states in the country to have class in person. So I was a substitute teacher for classes at that time during the fall. And then since I've moved back here to the Bay, which is my hometown, I've worked at another school, a charter school, but essentially functions as a public school called Ascend, which is an acronym, I'm not sure what it stands for, in Oakland, in the Fruitvale. It's been fully virtual, but we're going back to school starting in 2 weeks. And we serve a predominantly 95% Latinx and Indigenous Guatemalan population. And so the different communities that I've served have been very different in the rural Midwest versus here in the heart of Oakland in the Fruitvale district, as well as the students that I've worked with, or, you know, children in the summer camps and church settings that I've taught around Portland and the Bay Area throughout my life. Very different communities, very different needs, and very different experiences with that. But I think all across the board, given my diverse experiences, I think that my like ethos and my code of conduct really revolves around like planting seeds, right? So giving kids the tools they need to empower themselves, helping kids feel comfortable in spaces that were not meant for them, giving kids the things that they need to feel good and to succeed and to articulate, you know, their visions and like, you know, just be comfortable in their beautiful spirit. So that's how I roll. I'm gonna go to grad school this summer and become a credentialed English teacher. But for now, I work with students with disabilities and students with IEPs, which is a plan for specialized education or adaptive education in 2nd, 4th, 5th grade. And then I also substitute math in 8th grade, which is something I never thought I'd do, but we're out here. I'm gonna pass to Samrath.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so I graduated December 2019 as a history major at Reed. I did a lot of really fun things. I was a K-Rock DJ for all 4 years, managed the radio station, was involved in the Reed College Creative Review, and also founded the Students of Color community in my first year. And then senior year, which was really pivotal for me, I started working in the special collections and archives. And around November, because I was an international student, I was getting my job for my OPT in order, or trying to. Thankfully I did. I started reaching out to Portland-based apparel companies, Nike being at the top of my list and the one that I went after a lot, and eventually got a meeting with someone in the department of Nike archives, and then eventually a job offer. And so between December, going back home, month and a half later, coming back to Portland, started at the Nike archives on the apparel team. And then 3 weeks later, COVID hit. So that was really interesting. But my job was to catalog basically mostly older product, at least 10 years old, and write product content. So that's basically, you know, if you were on a website and see a piece of clothing, it would be, what is like the materials composition, how much does it weigh, all of that stuff, and then what technology is involved in the clothing, and is there a backstory? So of course at Nike, a lot of things come from specific product lines, and also sports, and then things related to athletes. I signed a non-disclosure agreement, so I can't say what specifically I worked on, but you can imagine the athletes associated with Nike and all of their sometimes even worn and signed clothing will be coming to us. So a lot of really cool artifacts. And also then, because my OPT ended in January, I then moved to Canada, where I am now, because I was able to get Canadian green card with my family. and now I'm looking at other apparel companies, mostly that are Canadian based or international that have a Canadian office, and have been, doing the whole applying, and thankfully also started interviewing at places as well. So that's where I'm at. And then Lillyanne.
I was going to mention that Hayden threw a comment in.
I'm like out of the Zoom game, so this is.
I just put in there.
Thank you.
Yeah, we still talk about it all the time. Like Samrath, in like the best possible way, called out the things that we were not doing well and that we needed to better educate ourselves on. And we still all the time, especially Shania and I, will be like, man, just really change things for us, like in the best way. So
no, that I remember that conversation with Shania so clearly, and I'm so glad we could have that really honest discussion. Yeah, so thank you.
Cool. Hi all, Lillyanne, they, she, GM pronouns, and I graduated from Reed in 2020 with a sociology degree. Yes, we all made it out of Reed. I think that's the biggest accomplishment I can say for right now. Right now I'm in AmeriCorps Visa through Mercy Corps, and basically AmeriCorps Visa is kind of like Peace Corps, but in the US. And if you want to talk about it, I'm more than happy to talk about it. There's pros and cons, and I'm currently located in the historic Park Rose area. It's Sandy Boulevard from 99th to 121st Street. That's where I do most of my work in East Portland, especially in Park Rose, for context, is a district within East Portland. But I work with youth of color and unsheltered communities in Park Rose. Yeah, currently I'm in East Portland working with Unite Oregon and Apano just on like immigrant refugee projects. I'm on the curatorial committee for Apano, so I work directly with low-income residents in East Portland, focusing on art engagement. For the fall, I'll be going to PSU's Art and Social Practice program, which is an MFA program. And social practice, for context, is kind of like art activism mixed with like social work. And yeah, if you want to talk more about that, I'm more than happy to. But yeah, going from a sociology degree to like an art degree was kind of nerve-wracking for me. I think I spent this year, I also broke my ankle right after I got out of Reed. So I was like bedridden for 5 months or so, and I had like surgery. So if like there's not much to say in between that, it's because I really just have been gone. But yeah, at Reed, I also worked at CLBR, Student Center, got really involved, and I really don't think I'd be able to be where I am at without like the MRC, Seeds, and CLBR, especially Hayden, yeah, and Jessica. Y'all like helped me out so much, so I'm so happy to be here. But yeah, that's my intro.
I love that. Thank you. Thank you so much, Lillyanne, and the rest of our panelists. Thank you so much for sharing a little piece of your story and a little bit of your journey with all of us. I know that we stand to learn quite a bit from all four of you. So thank you so much. As I was hearing you all kind of speak about the diversity of your experience and your paths, right? It makes me think about maybe one thing that you all may have in common, and I could imagine that most of us have in common, is just this idea around how we've been socialized to think about professionalism, right? Or to think about and assign value to people, places, things, behaviors, right? And so when I think about how I was socialized to think about, professionalism, there were some innate kind of deficiencies, right? That I was like, there's something maybe wrong with who I am or how I'm presenting authentically. And that kind of, like, to use your word, Hayden, provided some dissonance for me to kind of think about critically, like, that doesn't feel good for me. And so I'm really curious to know, in terms of maybe how you all were socialized, or maybe thinking back to your first exposure to professionalism, what were you told about what it looks like? How was it defined for you? And then also maybe thinking about like, how do you define professionalism? So Samrath, I'm going to go right back to you on that question.
Yeah, so I mean, growing up, my parents were academics. They've changed careers now. Um, and so coming to Reed, I was pretty familiar with that environment, and there weren't that many things that kind of threw me off beyond just how white the institution is. And um, as I was thinking about what I want to do post grad and the types of places that I want to work, I was very sure that I didn't want to be in kind of a rigid, like suit and tie kind of environment, thinking of it at a very kind of surface level of just what am I going to be physically doing at work every day? And is that, am I going to be comfortable in the environment? And for me, comfort just literally meant, what am I going to be wearing? What's the kind of environment around me? How kind of formal is it? So again, very surface level things. And luckily, place like Nike, I could literally just wear running shorts and a t-shirt for like the 3 weeks we were in the office. It did not matter as long as it had a Nike logo on it. And then beyond that, kind of, the first realization for me was, oh, I'm one out of 3 out of 30 something people in my department who isn't white. And then I was like, oh, I have to kind of think more critically about this. And, you know, at first, the first like week was a little weird. I was, having to explain how do I pronounce my name 10 times over, correcting people, and they would just say Sam instead of Samrath, and dealing with all those little things. But then honestly, with COVID hitting and working from home for a year, it made life a lot easier. You don't have to worry about a lot of things. And so I'm honestly very apprehensive about going back to in office, in person life, because all I've known professionally is Zoom and virtual work. So I think honestly, I haven't been necessarily challenged very much in a professional environment yet because of this virtual world we're living in right now.
That is very fair. Totally can see how that could kind of shape your experience, COVID, and all of its fascinations, right? So Paapa, I'm going to send that question back over to you. So the question was, what was your earliest memory, your first exposure to professionalism? Also share maybe how it was defined for you, and maybe how have you come to define it for yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Melanie. It's interesting. It's a tricky thing, I think, for me to answer in a way, because I think my earliest or first exposure to it was just being in Ghana. Life in Ghana is very much still, I think much of the culture still swims in relics of the colonial era. So like standards of what it means to be professional tend to be connected to how you look. And unfortunately for most people in Ghana, it meant really short hair, so buzzed hair, no beards, looking really clean, really sharp, and suit and tie, even if it's like 100 degree, just these very absurd standards that may have made sense for a different culture, but through time and through imperialism and more, we've just sort of absorbed it in the culture, and we are assuming in that. So that made it really challenging for me growing up as somebody who's always loved long hair. Like ever since I was a kid, I always wore some afro or something. And that got me into a lot of trouble in school all the time. I was like often advised to not be a bad boy, which meant having like long hair. Like that was it. So I think in the adult's mind, all of those constraints are meant to help set you up for the professional world. Like, from as early as like, your first grade, that's the thing that you're looking for. I have to point out one thing before I move on. I have a bit of a stutter. So every now and then I will buffer like a YouTube video in low Wi-Fi. So when that happens, I'm okay. I'm not dying. We're okay. But so anyway, so that's something that was interesting. So I think like in moving here into the US, I actually experienced a lot less professionalism than I had ever experienced, especially being at Reed, and we just seeing everybody doing a lot more than I thought we were allowed to do in life. And so that made me like realize how entrenched that idea of like being professional, being clean cut, being all that, like how just entrenched in the water it was in Ghana. So I think being at Reed allowed me to explore like my own values of like what it meant to be a professional or be an effective member of a society. And I think how I define it for myself now is in one, always executing as well as I can with whatever the responsibility is, right? Making sure there's not a shadow of doubt about my skill level with the job at hand. And then also making sure I work with empathy. That is a leading and guiding philosophy for me, which I really fight to hold. In fact, one of the main reasons I actually moved from my previous role in pricing at Viewpoint into my role now was um, I didn't have the type of leadership in that role that that basically supported my emphasis on empathy. I was often like encouraged to drive, make sure other departments do what we want to do, and And it's like, yo, you have to work with other people. You have to work with people and work with people as people. And that was just always a rub. And I just said to myself, I am not going to be in a space where that is not um, accepted or encouraged and all that. So that's one of the things that led me into my new role, which I'm absolutely loving. And so anyway, so that's how I now define it for myself. Be myself, one. Number two, executing as well as I can in my responsibility. And number three, leading with empathy. And that's it. That's it for me.
Thank you. That's so
Yeah.
important. I love that you bring up empathy. It reminds me of, how we can hold and honor each other's humanity in our work, even, in our communities that we're creating, our work communities and work families. That's still really important. So thank you so much for mentioning that. So Jacey, over to you. Same question. What was your first memory or exposure to professionalism? And then Lillyanne, I'm going to go right next to you. To you next.
Awesome. Thank you, Melanie. I'm thinking about my first experiences with professionalism. I think definitely the first thing that comes to mind is that for folks like educators, community organizers, and social workers, we are always involved in a politics of care and providing support, which is really, really hard to quantify. And so professionalism for educators, I think, is difficult to pin down, especially because every school, even extremely equity-oriented schools, have their own specific like culture with regards to what is and isn't accepted in the workplace. And so the way that I think about professionalism for me personally is like how, because I'm serving someone, my job is always to serve a student or a group of students, like how am I best meeting the needs of the people that I'm working with? And I think that like anyone in any job can ask themselves that, but particularly for those of us who are like in contact with young people, I think that that's crucial. And I think that like evolving definitions of professionalism in educational workspaces are getting better. And there's definitely also a lot of room for improvement. I think that given my career of choice, I also am lucky to have experienced like, you know, classroom spaces as a student. And so I saw a lot of models from the time I was a little kid of what to do and of what not to do in order to prevent or perpetuate harm in classrooms. And the way that children are treated by adults around me is something that I've been, you know, conscientious of all the time I was growing up. And you know, yeah, my dad, I think a lot of working class families really hold on to a traditional idea of professionalism. When I was a kid, I would ask my dad for help on my homework, and like I always regretted it because he would sit down and be like, okay, you gotta map it all out, and it would take like hours longer than I thought it would, because he was very deliberate about everything. He's a house painter, and now he's also a security guard, and he's very like, you know, wants you always to be dressed for the occasion and to use proper language and to like look people in the eye, which I think are all important, valuable things when they're given the right context. um, and I think that there's a lot of like respectability politics that play into growing up in a low income family and the idea of what you're supposed to be, especially being like a first generation college student. Or, you know, my mother went to community college, but I'm a first generation 4-year college student. And so yeah, that's been a lot that I've like found useful, but also had to unpack and relearn in ways throughout my life and throughout my professional career, which I also think like, you know, like I said, working with children is just a lot of organic interactions that you just can't be like, this is what to do and what not to do. But most people have, you know, come into contact with children in their life, and you kind of have an understanding of how to talk to children and how not to talk to children. I think that that's a skill that can be developed over time. And I think that it also like is very reflected in how much you are invested in the communities that you're working with and how many identities you share in common with the people you're working with. I have resonated so much with the like extremely different just across the spectrum in terms of like, you know, race, culture, gender, class, of the communities that I've worked with and that I've been involved in, and definitely like been surprised at how many things I've found in common with the students I've worked with that I didn't think I would have anything in common with, particularly in the rural Midwest. Yeah, so I think that it's a constant series of like unlearning, and most of the people in my family also have experience in the education industry. My dad and my brother are track coaches. My mother works with like ECE or early childhood education. She works at a preschool that runs out of our church. And my sister is a social worker who works with houseless youth from like, you know, teenage going into the 20s, which is an underserved population in the houseless community. So we all work with kids, we all share ideas. It's very much like a, you know, it's a family affair. So I'm really lucky to have that, and to have that like notion of what to do at work is always like learning and growing.
Thank you so much for that, Jacey. I just wanted to highlight Jessica's comment around resonating with class identity and how that intersects with your ideas around professionalism. And I think that that's so incredibly valid. And so thank you so much for bringing that up. Lillyanne, I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, no, I resonated with y'all's comments so much. I just want to also mention that before I start, I was in an emerging leaders program, which is like job networking for POCs during the summer. And I took this course thing training, and they're just like, what kind of worker are you? And there's different types of worker, but I found out like I'm the kind of worker that I need to be in a workspace that aligns with like my personal life, and like also like my work is where I live as well. I know a lot of people like separate the two. So before like I kind of start talking about what professionalism means to me, I just want to say like that's the place where it's coming from, as like someone who can't fully function in a space that like doesn't align with me. But yeah, like, I don't know, just similar as Jacey said, I grew up in a trailer park in like middle of Indiana, a very small town, Columbus, Indiana. And my family was there because they were sponsored by a Catholic church. And I also went to Catholic school on like that whole sponsorship thing. So when I think about professionalism, I really like go back to how like tucking in your shirt, not being loud, being respectful, clean, are you able to fit into this Catholic community as being like professional? And like when I think of professionalism, like can you fit into this workspace? Are you like the right person for this, and if not, then you shouldn't be here, you should be punished, you should be out. I know punish is like a large word, but I think that's kind of like where I go with it when you don't fit into the professional ideal. But yeah, I think that now I'm working with youth of color, and they're high schoolers, by the way, so they're kind of already thinking where they want to be after graduating, and a lot of them don't want even to go to college. So when I talk to them, I kind of think of professionalism as, well, there's this one workshop we're doing, there's 8 workshops, and one of them's jobs and home-based businesses, and this is going to be happening in 2 weeks, but right now I'm kind of tackling on to how to address professionalism with them. And so far, I think I'm just going to be like, professionalism, people have all their definitions, always take it with a grain of salt, but like stay true to you. And of course, like professionalism gets like more complicated as you grow into like having to pay bills and having to survive. And especially if you're Indigenous, Black, or Brown, like it's going to be 10 times harder. And the like professionalism gets even like more complex. But like, I really do believe when we start small and just saying that, like, stay true to yourselves. I know that's like very cliche, but just starting with that small idea can like change something like bigger. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of all I have to say. I know that sounds pretty cliche a little bit, but really just stay true to who you are and be in spaces that make you feel welcomed and make you feel true if you're that kind of like worker. And it's okay if you're like a different type of worker where your lives are like separate from job and your personal life. So yeah.
Thank you so much. I would go out a limb here and say that that isn't cliche. I think it is a really great reminder for us to be thinking about how we're harnessing our own kind of authenticity and how that shows up, right? And I also appreciated you were talking about, you know, this idea around culture of fit and problematizing that. And then also thinking about the responsibility that we have to find, you know, organizations or companies that we're working with that really align with our values, right? So thank you so much for mentioning that.
Perfect. Sorry. I'm going to drop the second question in the chat, but I also just, wanted to come back to what you had said, Lillyanne, about sort of feeling like if you don't fit, that there's punishment associated with that. And I don't think that's too heavy of a word to use, because in so many cases, when a workplace feels like someone is not meeting professionalism, or more likely not really blending or integrating with sort of the dominant culture in that workplace, there are repercussions for that, which can be losing your job because you haven't dressed the right way, or you, like Paapa was saying, like you have your, your hair doesn't look the right way, or whatever it may be that they have deemed that they are going to use to other somebody that isn't fitting in with that there is a punishment associated with that. And it is a very unfortunate reality of the way that people can twist and use professionalism as a way to discriminate and leave people behind in the professional world. So the next question we have for all you panelists is, how have you either embodied, interrogated, resisted, or redefined professionalism? And what are their impacts on your career, personhood, or positionalities that has had? And I've also dropped that in the chat if you'd like to see that as well. And we can start with Samrath, if you want to start, and you all can also feel free to like popcorn in if a question doesn't feel like it resonates with you as deeply. I want you to all feel free to pass if you'd like to. But yeah, Samrath, if you have something to say, go for it. I'm going to put you on the spot though.
No, I think I'm definitely one of those people that compartmentalizes the kind of work and rest of my life. So for me, after kind of finding an industry and identifying companies after a lot of research that kind of fit with how I see my like day-to-day work life, I'm not very much like concerned beyond that. And if I can just have like, a pleasant relationship with my coworkers, maybe even befriend some of them, I'm not that concerned. And, hopefully if issues arise, then there is a way to talk about it. But also, I get that fear of if something does happen and if I speak up, what are the consequences? What is the punishment? And so part of me is like, oh, just head down, do the work, whatever. But what happens when that doesn't become possible anymore? And yeah, I'm, not sure if I have the skills to handle that because I really haven't had to yet.
Thank you, Samrath, for sharing. It's such a weighted thing to have to deal with in your workplace, particularly, I think, if you are someone who likes to be able to compartmentalize and keep those things a little bit separate, like you're forced to kind of put yourself in a position where you may have to be more vulnerable or direct about something than you would actually like to be when you're at work, which is totally fair. Everybody has a different way that they'd like to show up. I personally cry like 18 times a day, especially if there's a sad dog commercial on. But come hell or high water, I will not cry at work. like I totally understand that sort of dissonance between like who you want to be all the time, and then is in some ways how you control what that looks like when you show up to an office space. Jacey, would you like to go ahead to answer this question?
Yeah, sure, for sure. I'm trying to think about, how my answer to this question differs across like the different workspaces that I've encountered. And I think the first thing that comes to mind is the way that I resisted the definition of professionalism that I encountered when I was working in rural Iowa, being the only queer person that I saw in any of my workspaces. And also as a substitute teacher, I worked across 3 rural districts. And so I probably worked in about like maybe 12 to 15 schools over the course of like 4 months. A lot of schools I would go back to over and over, but then, often I would be introduced into a new workspace and a whole different staff of people and a different like, teacher lounge kind of like culture and norms. And I didn't see any other queer people. I rarely even saw queer people in Iowa itself. Some people I like thought would be, queer looking at them, but then it turns out that they were just really poor because queer culture stole from working class culture aesthetically. So that was like really interesting for me to like just be kind of on my own and to have to like be like a queer token for people who had never like seen a butch woman before, or who assumed that I was a trans man. So people who were more like articulate in like queer community and understanding queer community would misgender me, which I thought was really interesting. And so like just for my first day as a substitute in the Midwest, I was like, I don't know what to wear because they were like, women should wear this and men should wear this. And I was like, that was definitely something that was a culture shock for me from moving on to Reed, where, your dress code is not really like a source of concern or a source of focus. Moving on to like the Midwest, where what you dress like matters, I think, a lot more, especially in educational spaces. And also folks who would make fun of my name. I was very grateful for my whiteness, and my white passingness is a privilege that protected me from the things that I saw against like the few people of color in the Midwest that I encountered. But there were students who made fun of my name in a way that like I was not expecting, and to have to take them aside and explain to them, or what I did and what I planned to do when the events happened, were to ask them like, who in your life taught you that it was okay to make fun of people with Latinx names, and let's unpack that. And these were like, not elementary school students, they were older, and so I thought that they could handle those conversations. That's definitely a way that I've like challenged the definition of professionalism in my areas that I've worked in the Midwest. And then out here in the Bay Area, I think like a way that I go about my work is to really just unpack all of the different things that kids encounter that I think might cause them harm. And I think that that is another way of redefining what it means to be professional and what it means to be effective in a space, and to really like talk to students on their own terms, especially because often I'm seeing the insides of their houses when I speak to them, and it's a very intimate, personal setting. And a lot of children are hesitant to share themselves with the computer screen. And so I think that intimacy and that humanness, like we do a lot of what we call human check-ins with students and just kind of like hanging out as much as we are completing work online. And so I think that really like contributes to my efficacy as an educator in this like new bizarre mosaic of technology that we find ourselves in when we're trying to teach kids how to read and write, because like that's really hard in person, and it's even harder to do over the computer. So I think that with the whole goal being like serving the needs of students and making sure that when they do get back inside classrooms, that it's as easy as possible for them to transition and be the kind of students that they deserve to be and have the safe spaces they deserve to have. Like, how do we best do that? So sometimes that means reinforcing some things that I've learned as part of being professional. And sometimes that means resisting against the notions of what I've learned that you should and shouldn't do in a workspace. I also think it's like something I wanted to bring up in this workshop, and I may as well bring it up now, is that it's like really important to have professional boundaries. Like when I was a student at Reed, I loved going to class, and I also worked multiple jobs during my time there. And some of my classes were at night and that kind of thing, and so it was really hard moving from being like a learner to being a teacher. And I think people don't often talk about that enough, but at Reed, it was kind of like I lived on campus. I was in HA for 2 years, and then I lived in the Birchwoods just across the street. So my whole life pretty much was Reed, and that's just not the way it is now as a working person. And I think like, actually having like an 8-hour workday and being like, I'm going to get work done from this time to this time and then stopping is something that I never like gave myself the privilege of doing at Reed, and now I do. And I think that that's been really life-saving, and having those boundaries is really important. And I think that everyone, no matter what your job, should try and do that. And I know that as Reedies, we try to overcompensate, we try to overachieve, especially those of us from marginalized backgrounds. But you guys do deserve a rest. And so I want to just like reiterate, especially for those of us who are working in educational spaces or who are working in spaces that may resemble Reed after Reed, it's okay to take a break. It's okay to like stop working at 4 p.m. and be like, I'm just going to vibe out and like not think about anything too complicated for the rest of the day. You deserve that. So I think like that's another notion of professionalism that I learned at Reed that really served me, but that I now try to actively push against.
That's awesome, Jacey. Thank you for sharing it. Yeah, I mean, I think that the sooner you can learn your professional boundaries and also personal boundaries, right? Like, I don't know that necessarily has to be like a professional thing, but like where and how you want to prioritize what brings value to your life is like one of the most integral things that you can learn, both as a working professional or just like as an adult human person, because it can completely change your workplace satisfaction and your overall just sort of like life satisfaction when you can start to create some boundaries and some space to be able to say like, actually today I'm not going to do that, and that's totally okay. So that's awesome. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, I think that was really, really, really powerful, and I think fundamentally the idea of being able to on some level just have those boundaries, but also when you're in those spaces, still being yourself and activating all the parts of yourself that are you. I think that's how I would say I have been able to be, I'll say that's how I have effectively you know resisted it, because it's interesting that so my full name is Edwin Paapa Mensa. I've almost never gone by Edwin, like never in my life, except at like airports and other places where they say my name. And so it was interesting while I was applying for different jobs here in the US. There were months and months and months where I was not getting any calls, and so I decided to I was like, you know what, being here in the US, Paapa makes some people uncomfortable because it's like their grandpa's name or whatever, so maybe let me go with Edwin Manson, which I feel very, very uncomfortable. Like, I've never gone by it. It doesn't feel natural to me. And so I sent some applications in as Edwin, and I would get some callbacks, here and there. I'm like, oh, this is interesting. But then I was like, okay, so what if I do get a job as Edwin and then I'm being called Edwin every single day, and I'm like, I don't, that's not me. So I went back to just making sure I just sent every application as that, as the name that I definitely felt was me, because that represented the best parts of me. And so I think just being able to make that decision early on and sticking with that, even if it may have led to more months of waiting for a job. I think I effectively landed in roles that I felt were more me, because they wanted me, and they had no issue with my name or whatever. And so I think just being able to resist by being your authentic self has been my motto.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And I also want to emphasize, yeah, being yourself. No, I like, yeah, pulling some heartstrings. uh, yeah, so I think I would say that to address professionalism, I've learned to like be 100% fearless and like letting go, whether that means like giving yourself like 1% to your work or just quitting your job. And I've been able to like learn this because like I worked in spaces at Reed and like watched a lot of my mentors do the same. And I'm lucky and I'm grateful to have seen that during my time in Reed, because that's what really helped me transition out of Reed. And during Reed, I faced a lot of microaggressions, but like when you leave Reed, you don't really have, like as a student worker, you have better HR support than you do as like someone without like a college institution. And like, I hate using the word adult, but like, I'm gonna use the adult in quotation marks. When you become that, it's just like those microaggressions, you either combat them as an individual or you just don't at all. And I learned that like right when I got out of college, I worked for a for-profit company, and yeah, it was a whole company of white people. And the fact that I was the only Vietnamese person there, the only person of color there, they invited me to this meeting to give them another department advice on how to hire more genders and more people of color. And this is during like the Black Lives Matter movements within the summer. So statements were coming out and they'd make another meeting for me to come on. By the way, my role was like a marketing designer person. But yeah, they invited me to this meeting, and during COVID-19 remote time, it's like amazing. I love it, to be honest, being remote. But they invited me to the meeting and I said no on the email. And then, no word back because they're from another department. Then someone in my department was like, hey, did you get that email? And I was like, yeah, I did. I said no. And then they're like, oh, well, you should go to that meeting. And I said, oh, no, I'm okay. And then the next like day, the department said like, you need to come to this meeting. And I said, all right, I'll come to this meeting. So I came to the meeting, and I was like, your whole department's white men, and you expect me to help you try to bring someone in by fixing the words on your job call out, because like that's what they brought me in, was to edit the words on their job call out. By the way, that's how companies get you in, so like do your research on your companies. But yeah, I told them off, and then they were like, oh, I'm so sorry, like I didn't mean to. And I'm like, I told you I didn't want to come to this meeting. First of all, I said no. Anyways, point is, I asked to leave the place a week early because my contract was just for the summer. And then their HR person was also their CFO. So like HR exit wasn't that good. It was just a bad experience, but like I had so much power to say no. I had so much power to leave early because of the networks and communities I made at Reed and also in Portland. Because like, a lot of people don't have that privilege just to like leave a job, but like really rooting yourself in your like connections, regardless of whether they're in academia or like your friends have jobs or not, just like sharing that like love with people, you'll have like a network to be able to say like, no, I don't want to do it. And you're going to face that so many times. And especially when you leave Reed, it's going to feel like the end of the world, especially during COVID as well. But yeah, just like really making those like strong connections with your community, I really recommend.
Thank you so much for that. Oh, Hayden, I cut you off. Go ahead, please.
Oh no, I was just gonna be like snaps for Lillyanne, and also like absolutely as someone who spent a long time in a workplace that made me feel like, who definitely used sort of the ideas of professionalism to make me feel like I was not good at my job because I didn't align with what they considered professionalism. Having support and people in your corner who can support you in that process is really valuable, because it is really, really hard. Sometimes leaving it can be really scary when you feel like you don't have other options. So thank you for bringing that up, Lillyanne.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally resonated with me as well, kind of hearing your story and your experience, Lillyanne. So thank you so much for sharing that. It kind of makes me kind of go back to my last employment site and just kind of thinking through like how unsurvivable sometimes white supremacy culture is and how it's meant to be, and how resilient a lot of our communities are of minoritized folk, and knowing that our peoples have survived so much treachery, and it's really unfortunate that we're still kind of doing this work to undo and to decolonize the ways in which we are participating and engaging in community at work, right? White supremacy culture is so incredibly just abrasive, right? And it's one of those things that we see time and time again, and the impacts, right, are so incredible, right, in terms of racial battle fatigue and isolation, exclusion, stereotype threat, right, other like code switching, all of these things that we were kind of trained to do to kind of cope. And really what we should be thinking about is how do we liberate these work environments so that we can all exist as our authentic selves. So thank you so much for talking about that and talking about the agency that takes to make that decision to leave. So I want to just kind of transition a little bit. There's a couple of questions that I think I'm going to merge for the sake of time. And now thinking about them, they complement each other really, really well. So panelists, you know that 3 and 4 are separate questions, but I'm going to merge them. So I want to ask you, and I'm going to start with you, Paapa, if you can talk to me about how you have been navigating and negotiating the workplace and thinking about your identities. And then if you can couple on that answer to think about like what you wish you would have known before participating in the workforce, right? Given how you're navigating and negotiating identity now.
Yeah, that's kind of a lot, but I'll do my best. So I think the way I have negotiated that or navigated that so far has been, I have this real belief, or I've had this main belief that has led me to where I'm at now, that I am not the only one who wants to be in a space or work on a team or where I can be myself. Like I can't be the only one who wants it, right? This is just, I'm not that special to be the only one, right? So that therefore means that there are other people who might even be in positions of power who want that, who also want that for themselves. And so what I really actively did in my company was I networked a lot with other directors of different teams and different departments here, to see like there has to be at least one of these folks who I can align with on my core values, which I ended up finding, and so I think in just having that undying belief that I am not the only one who wants these things, I think that's kind of helped me to negotiate that, and so I wish I had known that years ago, because I think I only had this new conviction maybe in the last 3 years, which is when I started to then grow my locks and just kind of be more of myself, because I was like, wait, there has to be other people out there, and so I wish I had known that years ago, because then by now my locks would be as long as Melanie's, and then I'll be a happy person. Oh man, beautiful. So jealous. But anyway, never too late. But I'll say that's my short answer to that. I mean, I could go on for maybe like an hour, but I would just like to keep, leave it there and not yeah, not take up too much space. But that's my short answer for that.
Thank you. I don't want us to think about time. I want to respect y'all's time, but I don't want you to feel pressed by time answering. This is
Sure.
a space designed specifically for you and for us. So please take the time that you think is necessary to answer the questions. Thank you.
I appreciate that. I also can be long-winded, so I have to be very disciplined. So, but I appreciate that. Thank you.
Oh my gosh, I before when we got the questions before the panel, something I wrote down with many exclamation marks was networking. I'm a big fan of networking because it's how I got my job at Nike. And also I think going back to what both Paapa just said, but also what Lillyanne brought up earlier, is that networking can have, I think, these two many uses, but one kind of practical thing of how do I find my next job through the people that I know, but also solidarity in knowing people from similar backgrounds, or who have been working longer but also share the same experiences, to just like you said, Paapa, to know that you're not alone in the working world. So network.
Thank you for that reminder. Networking is key. Social capital. It's one form of capital. Thank you. Jacey or Lillyanne, do you want to answer that question? If not, we can move to the next one.
Yeah, no, for sure. Lillyanne, do you want to go first? Okay, for sure. Yeah, I guess I'll talk a bit about my current workplace. Definitely something that I'm like navigating right now is, other than the transition from virtual back to in-person and meeting my coworkers in person for the first time, which is something that like has been comfortable for me in some ways and uncomfortable in other ways. Just again, as like a, visibly queer person, I think that's always going to be a difficulty for me, even given like, the great queer friendliness of the East Bay. There's just always that, and working with almost exclusively Latinx people has been really rewarding, like as a Latinx identifying person, but also like because I'm white as well, and because I have white passing privilege, I'm always like holding that in account and trying to make sure that I don't perpetuate harm in the spaces that I go into, whether that's virtual or whether that's like in the classroom when I do finally meet the kids that I'm working with. So I think that I'm always like trying to keep that in mind, and understanding as well that there's, I think like at a school, there's always going to be strata of jobs, right? You've got your staff that have certificates and that have gone to grad school to become teachers, and then you have your staff that have not done that. Your custodial staff, your support staff, paraeducators, often people who work with children with disabilities don't actually have degrees that specialize in working with children with disabilities. And so there's a lot of like complications that come with that. And just like the ways that different in-groups can form at schools based on like the level of privilege experienced by those different staff members. And sometimes I find myself like identifying with one in-group more than the other, and that's been like very interesting and very challenging as someone who like went to Reed and was in that elite environment for so many years and has a bachelor's degree, but also like comes from a working class family. And so I think like there's that opportunity to code switch often back and forth between like admin and other staff, and also because I'm very young in my workplace. So I think that that's like a constant challenge. One thing that I really want that I want you all to know before you participate in the workforce is learn how to ask your supervisor for a raise. I wish I know how to do that. I don't. And I think that it's really important to learn how to professionally and appropriately advocate for yourself, and to say, not just like, I need to be paid more for this work, but also to say, you need to give me less work. I think that second one is said less often, and it's just as important. So that's something that, especially for readies who love to take on more and more work until they break, I think it's really important to learn how to set verbal boundaries with your boss and say, like, you know, I'm not going to do this, or you need to make me not do this. So I think that's important.
Thank you.
Yeah, plug y'all's LinkedIn and don't be ashamed. And please, I already had one person reach out to me, but please feel free like to reach me if you all need like a connect or help with an application. I also used to be a peer career advisor, so I know some tips. But yeah, I think I wanted to mention, so my identities and then what I wished. So I'm currently working at Portland State University at the Women's Center. When I came in, you know, they were just kind of like, we're looking for someone who has experience in higher education, has like organized skills. I was like, yeah, I got that. So I went in, and I wish I had known that being a readie at Reed is different than being a readie in Portland, because being a readie in Portland, there's so much harm that Reed has done in the Portland community that folks don't address. And like, even though, like, for example, you know, I grew up on food stamps, you know, I'm like Vietnamese, like, you know, I was on financial aid, but still I was a readie. And like, regardless of like your intentions, you have an impact. And so being at PSU, like I learned that very quick. And I'm very grateful to have learned that, because like that place is bomb, and I like am excited to continue like organizing events there. But that's just like my first thing I wish I learned. And then my second one is I also work at Historic Park Rose as an AmeriCorps Visa, like I mentioned. I learned that, I mean, I've known this for a while, but I really came face to face with it in the Park Rose district, which, by the way, Sandy Boulevard used to be called Saigon Boulevard, and you know, largest, like the 12th largest Vietnamese community in this area. But you know, being Vietnamese is not enough. Being used to be poor is not enough. I say used to be poor because, you know, I'm not like, I don't own one pair of shoes. I can buy my own shoes right now if I want to, you know, at that level. So I'm not in the, even though I used to be in that community, whether it was homeless or being abused, like I'm not anymore. And working at Park Rose with all these vulnerable populations, it's just not enough. For example, like someone who speaks solely Vietnamese, we're offering a 5K grant to them, and they were like, no, I don't want it. And then because they don't trust nonprofits, obviously, like who would trust nonprofits? So why would you give free money? But people are like, Lillyanne, you should talk to them. You're like Vietnamese, like, you know, right? And I'm like, no, I don't know. I don't speak Vietnamese, but we attempted to try that kind of like, and it did not work, by the way. So I'm learning Vietnamese this summer. And I'm grateful to have been pushed to do that, because a lot of my clients are Vietnamese, and a lot of my clients are also unsheltered, by the way. And I used to be homeless when I was like a teenager, but like, you know, I try to like talk about my experience with them and like connect, but you're just not the same, you know. And like, you're in a different place now, and like, especially being a readie, and then also all the attachments that like going to college and a liberal arts college does to you, and all the privileges it gives to you. Like, you just have to remember that when you leave Reed, because like, really humble yourself and remember that even though what you used to be before Reed, you've changed. And like, also don't feel guilty for making it, because no one should normalize like fighting for survival is like a thing, you know. Like, I felt guilty for a really long time, like I'm not like fighting for my life anymore. But at the same time, like, whoa, like capitalism normalized that, and normalize it to be like cool, like pulling yourself up from your bootstraps kind of narrative. Like, no, that's not cool. Like, if I can just sit down and watch Netflix all day, like I don't know, that's the perfect life. You know, I'm so grateful. But yeah, that's all I have to say.
Thank you. Back to Jessica's comment, resting is revolutionary. and it is a resistance practice. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah, thank you, Lillyanne. I'm going to drop a link in the chat. It's about it's a book called The Privileged Poor, but I think it's a really interesting read. Some folks are probably Melanie's looks like she's like, yes, let's read it. But it focuses mainly on folks who are like still in college and in a higher education institution. But I think that it really highlights some similar notes to what Lillyanne is saying about the privileges that you've been afforded by being at Reed, and that oftentimes, especially in obviously the Portland area, there are a lot of negative connotations to being a Reedy or being associated with the Reed community. And so if you like to read about stuff like that, that's an interesting read. And then I'm going to pop our last question in the chat. So I'd love to hear folks, just kind of as a wrap-up question, and a lot of you have already spoken to this, so if there's anything additional you want to add, please do so. I'm thinking about like, how do you really embody authenticity, and how, you know, what privileges have you potentially been afforded by your identity, and also potentially like, what are some things that prevent you from being able to feel like you can be your authentic self in the workplace?
So I can answer, or I feel most equipped to answer a part of that. So I think one of the privileges that I feel I've been afforded that help me to be authentic, I feel are, I think, so being from Ghana, even though it's an African country and not here, I actually was in the majority group in Ghana. So I moved here to the US at age of 20. So I basically had like 24 years of feeling like a majority, and practicing that sense of ownership and confidence that I think naturally comes with. And so I think being here in the US, even though visibly a minority, I feel like a majority, right? I've had this, many years of feeling like that. And so I've noticed that I haven't, like, I've rarely second guess if I should be in a space or not, right? Because I haven't had years of feeling like that, right? So I think that's definitely one privilege that I think has helped me a lot, and I definitely want to acknowledge that. I think one of the things that maybe does prevent me from being like fully authentic is just, simply like language, right? So I mean, there's a dialect of English that is different here than in Ghana. So I often don't feel like I'm able to like fully express myself, not only just in the workforce, but even just in general. So I think that's maybe one area, but yeah, I do think that at least in the professional space, most of the things that I would like to express aren't as like I don't necessarily feel like I'm missing out on a whole lot there, because most of the things that I would like want to more naturally express would be more in a casual setting. So anyway, that's that.
Thank you, Paapa. Is there any other of our panelists who would like to add anything? Just as we're looking at the time, it's 5:50. So we're going to start transitioning towards wrapping things up. But if there's any last thoughts you have, either related to this question or just generally that you want to reiterate or make sure you say before we end our time together, please feel free to do that now.
or if you have any like, tactical questions or strategies that you want other students to have based on your experience, now would be a really great time to speak about that.
Yeah, I think a good, oh, sorry, Samrath, if you want to go, and mine's like.
Oh no, that was me just fumbling around.
Yeah, a good friend of mine asked me, what am I most afraid to say when I was in a conflict? And I was like, this. And recently I host meetings for houses outreach stuff, and the Portland Police Department wanted to attend my meeting. And as a Vista, AmeriCorps Vista, you're not allowed to have your own political beliefs within your, I know that's hard, but anyways, that's like government jobs. But basically, I was in my head, I'm like, I want to tell them like, no, fuck the police. Can I say that on the recording? But I'm gonna say that, fuck the police. And I didn't want them to come to like freaking houseless meeting because they're the ones who are doing the freaking sweeps and criminalizing them. Basically, that's what I was afraid to say. And then I also had like a really clean one, basically like, they'll make the safe unsafe. And a lot of people who come to these meetings are actually unsheltered. And like, I don't think that's a good idea. So what I did was combine the two. I started off with what I was afraid to say, and then following it up with like, the cushiony stuff. And so when you're in spaces like that, like, and you just have this like feeling in your chest that you just want to get it out, because like, if they don't take it as you like have it, like, screw them. But at the same time, like I said, I'm a type of worker that's at these spaces that I need to like combine my life and also have the privileges like with that context. But yes.
Thank you, Lillyanne. I just want to read Ashley's contribution here. She said, regarding authenticity, there can be enormous pressure in the workplace to pretend that you know things that you don't, and a lot of shame in admitting things that you're not an expert in, especially as someone of a marginalized identity. Authenticity can be owning the knowledge and life experience you do bring to the table, and worrying less about fitting the rigidity of the way some job descriptions are written. So thank you so much for that, Ashley. Thank you. So we do want to leave some time for questions, because I could imagine that, after getting the wealth and the abundance of the offering that the four of you have given us so generously, that there may be some questions. So I want to take some time to open up to the audience. If you have any questions about what you just heard, if anything resonated with you, if you want to, give some kind of offering to our panelist in terms of appreciation, we'd appreciate that. But yeah, so go ahead and open up for questions, and I'm going to pop a resource in the chat box for us to refer back to when we're able.
I want to just elaborate on my comment really quickly and say what Lillyanne just added. It's really important when you're entering the workplace not to be discouraged by job descriptions, because there's more than one way to come by a skill set or a life experience. Because you're not degreed in something or pedigreed in the way that a job description has it written that they would like you to be. I think that's also a remnant of white supremacy culture and class culture and academic sort of kerfluffle in a way that I desperately don't want to see students be discouraged by. I apply for things constantly that, like, based on the way it's written, I probably have no business applying for it, but I've come by those life experiences and skill sets in other ways, and that's totally valid. So don't let job descriptions make you feel like you're not a fit for a role or a position.
Thank you for that, Ashley. Are there questions for our panelists as we wrap up? I'm perfectly fine with silence. If you are not, that's okay. I want to keep this open for questions, and then also maybe make this a multi-use, multi-purpose space. If there's anything else, panelists, that you also wanted to add, we would love to hear your final thoughts. And then just a little reminder, in the chat box, there's a partial guide. I say partial because this is not comprehensive, but a partial guide to critiquing and navigating professionalism. It's very reflexive and for our kind of individualized journey to think about what professionalism looks like for us.
I dropped a question into the chat, but I'm hoping maybe some panelists can talk about what it means to be emotional at work, right? Because white supremacy culture tells us we can't be emotional. And what does that mean when we have marginalized identity, and also how does that feed into some stereotypes that we have related to identity? So I'm thinking about stereotypes of being an angry Black woman or a stoic Asian woman, right? Or even sort of back to Hayden's point before, right? You're not going to cry at work because that's just going to show a sign of weakness and you already feel vulnerable in that space, et cetera, et cetera. So just your thoughts around emotions and how we can navigate that authentically in the workplace.
Yeah, part of my, I think in line with my strong value on empathy is being able to be human and show emotion and lead in that way, and hopefully in doing that, that creates the space and permission for anyone around me to do the same. And so I've had some interactions with some leadership that was like, nope, that's not what we want here. But it's in doing exactly what I am convinced of that has led me to find people who want the same on their teams and all that. And so I think for me, it's important to show emotion at work. It's because I'm human, and if you do the math of how much time we spend at our jobs in relation to everything else that we do in our lives, we spend most of our time at our jobs, and so I don't want to spend most of my time not being human. And so that is a strong conviction of mine, and I have been fortunate to be to end up in spaces where that is welcomed and appreciated, and also there are spaces that don't want that, and that's fine. Just make sure like that, if that's important to you, make sure you don't lose that for any reason at all. But yeah, I have been really fortunate to find spaces that really value that and want that.
I will egg that person's house, Hayden. Give me the address. Oh my gosh. Yeah, it's 5:59, but I just want to say I don't put myself in spaces that make me feel like that anymore. But when I did, support systems, like everyone has said, networking with people that like align in solidarity and being yourself, and a solution. Like I'm at my PSU job right now, and all staff meetings about talking about appreciations for each other and appreciations for ourselves and just about our day. And that's what the whole meeting is about. I think like normalizing talking about like our personal lives at work is like a key if anyone's thinking about solutions on how to fix your workspaces.
Sorry, just getting a FaceTime request. Don't mind me. Gotta go back.
I do want to say something really quickly that I've been thinking about, and Jacey talked about this between, the Midwest and Bay Area, and like where you physically work, where you're living has such a big impact too on one's experience. And now living in Canada and talking to people here that I've connected with about my life and moving to the US when I was 6 and growing up in the US, the reaction that I got like really surprised me, and people have told me to leverage my Americanness and upbringing, which I never thought I would be doing in this way. And it's funny, it almost makes, 18 years of living in the US and like conforming kind of worth it, because now I can actually use that to my advantage. Because honestly, there is kind of a global American fascination. And Canadians, I think, don't like to admit to that, but they definitely have it. I was even told by someone to put where I went to high school on my resume to show as far back as reasonably possible that I am like American. So I know it's not possible for everyone to kind of leave and move to another country and work, but that's also not always out of the question. And it can surprise you a lot.
That's so interesting. That is like not something I would expect, mostly because the handful of times I've been out of the country, they're like, tell no one you're American. Nobody likes Americans here. So I just want to, since it's 6:01, it's a little bit after time, I want to say a huge thank you for our panelists for being here and taking the time to be with us today, to share. And also for the students and staff who made time to be here and participate in this conversation. This has been like, this has been really good. To say it in a like really dorky way.